Hi, everyone. My name is Erin Bagwell, and I am doing a presentation today on the history of the witch and unlocking your inner witch. I am so excited to dive in. I had the honor of doing a presentation for a community and organization earlier this week, and I thought I want to spread the love this Halloween and share what I know about the witch. I've been researching her for a couple of years now because I'm very interested in doing a documentary about her. And so I wanted to share with you what I know and maybe just unlock a little witchiness yourself. Before I begin, I want to introduce myself to those of you who don't know me. My name is Erin Bagwell. I am a medium, I'm a practicing witch, and I'm a storyteller. I had my 15 minutes of fame in 2016 when I produced Dream Girl, a documentary about inspiring and ambitious female entrepreneurs that raised $100,000 on Kickstarter, premiered at Obama's White House, and got the attention of folks like Oprah and Apple. I later went on and had kids and produced a second documentary about my postpartum experience called Year One. And then my life took a little bit of a turn, and I was actually on a girls' trip in Las Vegas with my book club to go to BravoCon when I was overwhelmed with the synchronicities and spiritual experiences I was having. I was actually mistaken for a medium, and it really inspired me to perhaps take my gifts a step further. I've always been a pretty intuitive person, but it wasn't until I started taking classes at Lilydale and studying with another medium that I really was able to unlock my gifts and really opened myself up to this whole new world of being a medium and a witch. And I've been sharing my experience under the moon gate, which is my podcast and blog where I share all of my tips and tricks and spiritual aha moments. I also want to note that I'm writing my first book called A Grimoire for My Daughters, which is half magic handbook and half spiritual memoir. So if you're part of my community, I'm so excited to continue sharing updates with you. My first draft is done, and so I'm deep, deep, deep into editing. And I also want to note that the moon gate is inspired by my actual garden. You can see my two daughters in the corner there running through our moon gate. So it's something that is a big passion and hobby of mine. And I learned so much about the world from being in the garden. Whenever I do a reading or a presentation, I like to just start off the bat by saying that I don't think that I'm special or unique because I'm clairvoyant or claircognizant or that I can speak to dead people. I think that I've just had the training and the support to be able to do so. I believe anybody can step into their intuitive gifts, and I hope workshops like this will open you up a little bit more to maybe viewing the world in a different way. I also want to share that I think that there's no rules in magic. I think there's been a lot of spiritual gatekeeping in the community. For example, some people believe you're not allowed to practice the tarot unless you're gifted a deck. And I don't believe that's true. I think that it's about exploring your own identity, your own relationship to spirit, and really playing with and feeling what feels good in your body. I might use the word spirit during this conversation. That's my non denominational word for God or the universe. As a recovering Catholic, I like that spirit just kind of encompasses everything. I also am part of the Church of Mary Magdalene, which means that I believe that we are 100% human and 100% divine. I share that because I think that spirit is the being and the force and the ultimate creation that I am tapping into to channel or to receive psychic or mediumship information. But I also believe that spirit lives inside of us and that each of us has the opportunity to tap into our own divinity. Now let's get into the witch. Okay, the witch is such a fascinating and complicated idea, archetype, creature, person, being, mother, maiden, crone, because it doesn't matter where you are in history, there's a version of the witch. And so, what is a witch? That question, it depends on where you're asking it, it depends on when you're asking it. If you go back into Greek mythology, you might see Circe, who's known for mixing potions and turning her enemies into animals. If you look into Japanese folklore, you might be familiar with the Yama-uba, which are these beautiful mountain hags that live in the mountains and protect the land, and they might eat you if they find you. Or if you're in Russia, there's the Baba Yaga, who is very famously known for having a house with chicken legs and giving you tasks and lessons to see if you're worthy of getting or achieving something. In American history, we have the Salem witch trials, and we also have a deep and rich culture of voodoo and hoodoo as well, especially in places like New Orleans. So the witch is an ever evolving, ever growing, very rich subject, and you could probably study and learn about her, for eons. I will say something that I find to be really interesting is Americans today, 7 out of 10 of them identify as being more spiritual than religious. And we're going to get into why I think that is, especially for women. But I think we're at a real turning point in culture where people are kind of stepping out of the structures that have been, in place for a long time and really reaching for something new. Now, my definition of the witch is somebody who is the ultimate authority of their spiritual experience. They are the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost all wrapped into one. The witch doesn't pray to any gods or beings above her. She really practices her own divinity within. And I think as a woman, I love this archetype of the witch because it really kind of gives you like the sky's the limit when we think about traditional religions that really structure around men in such a patriarchal way. If we're looking at Catholicism, we have the Pope and we have the bishops and we have the priests. I mean, women are not even really allowed to be near the altar. It's such an interesting structure. And I believe that this witchcraft boom is kind of taking over in the United States because women are really awakening to their spiritual powers and their spiritual cravings. And they're looking around at these institutions that aren't big enough to hold them. And so I love the witch in that way. I will also say, as a survivor of sexual assault, I love that the witch is also an archetype that sends, some chills up your spine. She's not a woman to be fucked with. She's a woman actually that we fear. And so I love the idea too that being a witch turns you from the lamb to the wolf. I think there's something really fascinating, especially for women, in exploring something that gives them power. Now, when we think about the witch, if you were to ask somebody what a witch is, 9 out of 10, they'll probably tell you about the Halloween witch. This is our iconic witch of the Middle Ages. Think tall, alewife hat, broomstick, riding through the night, a cackle perhaps. And there's a lot of different reasons for this iconography. And one of the main reasons that this version of the witch is so popular is because of its connection to the burning times. And this was an era around where women were actually tortured, they were separated from their families, they were imprisoned, and some of them were ultimately murdered. We know from history that we have from 50 to 80,000 women in the Middle Ages who were executed for being accused of witchcraft. Now, I'm using the word accused really intentionally here because we know from the historical documents, which we have from court cases, that some of these people who were accused weren't actually practitioners of witchcraft. That's not to say that women weren't, stepping into their powers and their divinity and all of the good mystic stuff, and we'll get to that. But this is just to note that anybody could be accused of being a witch. And in order to stop torture, they were encouraged to hand over new names of witches. So oftentimes we have letters from people who would write to their families and say, I'm so sorry that I named X, Y, and Z. I just wanted the torture to end. So we have these physical documents that say that people who were accused weren't necessarily practitioners of witchcraft. Now, I mention this because I think it's a really interesting concept to sit with just as a culture that we are able to kind of fall into and be preyed upon in this very polarizing way. Are you a witch or are you not? I think that those themes are very prevalent in culture today as well. And so I think it's really interesting to think about why we make people the villains, what it means about us, just something to kind of reflect and think about. And then to go back to our iconography of the broom and the cauldron, something really, really interesting is, every person in the Middle Ages had a broom and a cauldron. They had to be able to sweep their house and they had to be able to make food. It's akin to having a vacuum cleaner or an oven today. And so, again, these symbols that we associate with being just for one particular sect of people actually applies to everyone. Two other kind of witch facts while we're kind of here in the iconography. The tall brimmed hat, I believe, comes from the association of alewives. So, alewives were a group of women in the Middle Ages who actually used to brew beer, and they were known to walk around the markets with these really, really tall hats on, and so that they would be seen. And something else really fascinating about the alewives is that they had a lot of grain in their house. They would brew beer often from their own kitchens, and so they would often have cats around to be able to chase away the mice, to stay away from the grain. So that's another kind of connection we see, the big tall hat and the black cats, of course, as familiars. And the other thing that I think is really fascinating, that's just kind of another historical note, is if you fast forward to the Victorian era, there is, now stay with me here, I'm going to go on a historical tangent, but there is something called the Angel of the Hearth. And the Angel of the Hearth was this idea in the Victorian era that they wanted to keep women essentially away from commerce and money. And so the big branding idea for men was, okay, let's shove this idea and this image down women's throats. And so they don't want to be associated with business, and we keep capitalism out of their hands, and they pretty much like siphoned us away from finances. And so this idea of the angel of the hearth was like this goddess of the home. And they're like, don't worry about money. Don't worry about finances. Go back into the home. That's where you're the goddess. And the symbol for being the angel of the hearth was a broomstick and a set of keys. And I think it's so fascinating that in one era of history, if you had a broom, you were a witch. But if you're in another era of history, you have a broom and you're the angel of the hearth. It's so interesting how domesticity has continued to control women since the dawn of time, practically. So that's just a little note. Um, I also want to share about the broom that part of one of the reasons that it caught on so intensely was that newspapers love to publish a naked young woman with a broomstick. I learned this from Pam Grossman's classes, and it was a great way for them to sell newspapers. It was salacious, it was naughty, and it moved the papers. And the Catholic Church was also kind of part of this sexualization of women by saying that women who were a part of witchcraft were working with the devil, that they were having sex with him, that they were eating babies. And so kind of this very malicious villain figure really came to rise. And then was the fan to the fire was flamed by all these newspapers selling images of these women on broomsticks who were half naked. So who were witches? Were people practicing? Of course they were practicing. I mean, magic practices go back to Egyptian societies, go back to pagan societies, go back to really the beginning of the time if you look at the goddess era and how women were being bit by snakes in Greece and prophesizing. Women have been mystics, healers, herbalists, midwives. And so a lot of these women kind of got clumped into this space, but absolutely women in the Middle Ages were practicing and still practice today. Now, when we think about the horrific violence, the torture, the silencing of the Middle Ages, I think it's really, really important that we talk about the witch wound. Now, what is the witch wound? The witch wound is that part of us that's afraid if we step into our intuitive gifts, harm will come to us. And so it really teaches us to be silent, it teaches us to be small, and it teaches us to not share anything intuitive. And I have a subconscious belief that every woman carries this witch wound inside of her. And I think if you're a spiritual person and if you've ever kind of dabbled with coming out of the broom closet, 10 out of 10 times, you're going to have to reckon with your witch wound in order to get through it. I will say for me personally, it was a physical, visceral feeling, and I still feel it sometimes when I think about my past life regressions and I think about the trauma that I experienced. And I still feel fear sharing these stories. But part of it is kind of naming and reckoning with and kind of acknowledging it makes it a little bit better to come out. And I will also say Celeste Larson wrote a gorgeous book called Heal the Witch Wound. And I can leave a link below for a podcast I did about the book. But it's a beautiful reflection of not only the history of the burning times, but also ways in which we can heal our witch wound and honor space and comfort for our gifts. The other thing I want to note is that women were not allowed to and were encouraged to stay separate from one another. So this meant they weren't allowed to socialize or, get together in groups. Heaven forbid they be considered to be in a coven. And being called a witch could ruin your family's title for 3 generations. I mean, that's a long time. That's 100 years. And so these were serious allegations that people really, really feared. I think that the witch wound is something that is still actually inflicted upon us in culture today. I think we can look no further than the previous presidential election where Kamala Harris was actually quoted as cackling. There was a lot of talk about what it's like to be a childless cat lady, which Taylor Swift really took the mantle up for. But I think there's oftentimes where women step into their power or step into their sexuality or step into their divinity, like Serena Williams. And then we say, no, 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 we got to put her back in her place. And so I think we see the witch wound perpetuated in culture over and over again. Mary Magdalene is one of my favorite examples of being not only Jesus's favorite prophet, but the one who witnessed him at the resurrection and then was turned into a prostitute. I think she was one of the original witches in the Bible. However, something that I want to share is that not all hope is lost when we look at the Middle Ages. In fact, there was a group of women who were getting together, who were stepping into their spiritual power, who I'm completely and utterly obsessed with, and I can't wait to share them with you. They're called the Beignets. They were a non-secular group of women, and they built their own cities around spiritual growth. I mean, I can't even. Let's get into it. Okay, so first of all, the beignets lived in cities that were, it could be 20 people, it could be a village of 2,000. They were located in Spain, Germany, the Netherlands, France, Belgium. They were located all over. They could be single, they could be married. They were extraordinarily smart businesswomen. They owned their own land, they ran their own businesses, and they made their own money. Because they were not associated with any specific church, they ruled themselves kind of based on their location. So every community had a different set of rules and regulations. And they were pillars of their community. They ran hospitals, they took care of the poor, they were exceptional caregivers, and they even called the church out for hypocrisy. One of my favorite things about the beignets is that their churches were filled with women. Their iconography was all women, and their preachers were all women. I mean, I think when you think about that today, it feels absolutely radical to, to have an all-female run church. And I love the idea of stepping into a space where the iconography is women too. That's really, really something. They were ruled mostly by a group of elders. And yes, they were also accused of being witches. But because they owned their own land, they could afford lawyers. And because they were such pillars in their community by providing hospitals and care for the sick, people often sided with them. The other thing that was so incredible about these women is that they weren't just, pious nuns. They were mystic. They healed with hands, they channeled, they levitated, they had the stigmata. I mean, people would come to them for readings. They were really, really tuned into their inner feminine wisdom and their connection to the divine. Now, why is this important? I think this group is so radical because what we think about the witch is wrong. When we think about this solitary, isolated victim in the woods who nobody liked and everyone was afraid of, that's not true. The beignets are an example that show us that women were actually very in their spiritual power, very connected to their mystical and ancient wisdom, but they were actually living in communities. They were living in big communities. And I think that this is such a brilliant thing to keep in mind because the history books and the narratives that we read are not often written by women. And so we're not always getting the full story of what was really happening during this era. And so I think it's so important when we think about the witch to also think about the beignet. And I just wanted to share that I think part of the beignets' power is that they were living in community and that they were caring for one another and connecting with one another. And I love this quote by Jane Fonda because it really, I think it kind of sums up that feeling that when women get together, they are able to kind of elevate their frequencies and connect and find safe places to really be themselves. And absolutely, my female friendships make me stronger, smarter, and braver too. So, how do you become a witch? I've given us this elongated history of all the nuances of witches, and maybe right now you're asking yourself, how can I do spell work or step into my inner witchiness? What does it take to be a witch? What do you have to do to become a witch? Well, I actually asked my daughter this question yesterday, and she said, "Mama, you got to believe to receive." And that is really, I think, the key anchor of becoming a witch and doing spell work is you have to believe in magic. What does that mean? Sometimes when I sit down with a client, I can tell intuitively that they don't believe that I'm going to be able to read them. And guess what? A block goes up and I can't. If you don't believe, you don't receive. And the same is true for spell work. If you don't think the moon is going to infuse your water and grant your wish, it ain't going to do it. If you don't believe when you plant a seed in the garden for something to come into your life that it's not going to happen, then it won't. And so we have to believe in our intuitive ability to make magic and co-create with the universe. And I will say, this can be tough at first. It's not something that we're taught to do. And so baby steps, take little small steps to open yourself up to more magic. Now, you are in the right place if you want to learn more because I offer a beautiful intuitive class called Magic Lessons. I have one that's actually called How to Become a Witch, and I teach you spell work and I teach you the nuances of it, and I share some of my favorite spells. So if you want to get into the nitty-gritty of spell work, I'm happy to assist you on Magic Lessons. I will also say I think the best spells really come from the heart. If you want a protection spell or you want to attract more abundance into your life or you want to magnetize a new relationship, really sit with yourself, take 3 deep breaths, and ask your heart what you can do to kind of pull that forward. I will share some of my favorite spells, include the garden, include painting, including making altars. And I share all of this and more in Magic Lessons. So you can follow me either under the Moon Gate on Substack or Patreon, and you'll get access to all of my magic lessons. I also teach things like how to connect to your guides, how to get signs from your ancestors, how to connect to spirit, all kinds of really fun witchy stuff up there. Now, there's also other magical practices I wanted to note if you are interested in kind of diving deeper into your own intuition. I believe that learning the tarot is one of the most fun and concrete ways. I think it's like turns you into a baby psychic when you're really reading the cards and feeling intuitively what the messages have for you. You can practice sign work with the universe. You can have coffee with your ancestors. Meditation is, of course, a beautiful way to connect to spirit, starting a garden. Any creative pursuit where you're channeling makes you more connected. And make sure, guys, we remember to put down our phones and give ourselves space to really process and be in the earth and be human. If you liked this presentation today, I recommend obviously going under the Moon Gate, following me on Substack and Patreon. I also really recommend the Telepathy Tapes by Kai Dickinson. That is an incredible podcast about the telepathy between nonverbal autistic children and their parents and caregivers. A must listen. Heal the Witch Wound, as we discussed with Celeste Larson, a great book to kind of dive deeper into unpacking your own witch wound. If you're new to witchcraft and you want to learn more and you want like a little 101 guidebook, The Modern Guide to Witchcraft by Sky Alexander is one of my favorites. And also The Wisdom of the Beignets, which we talked about, by Laura Swan, and Mary Magdalene Revealed by Megan Watterson. If you're a recovering Catholic like me, it's the best book you could ever read. The BBC also produced a beautiful podcast called The Witch that gives you a pretty detailed synopsis of the burning times all the way up to kind of the laws and regulations and even some of the retribution that's happening today. So I would definitely give that a listen. Now, in order to unlock your inner witch, I think the best way to do that is to really go inside, go into a meditation, and really call upon your ancestors to help you unleash. Now, I have channeled a meditation for us called Unlocking Your Inner Witch. It's about 10 minutes long, and I'm going to leave it in the link below. So if you'd like to continue your witch journey with me, I welcome you to listen to the meditation, find a quiet spot to really get comfortable and unlock your inner witch. All right, to end, I'm going to pull a card for us from the Green Witch's Oracle deck. And let's see what Spirit wants us to know as we close out here. Ooh, we got the Seed card. Seed says new ideas, hope, open-mindedness. Look at Spirit. I love the idea that we are all planting little seeds to open up our intuitive gifts and to step into magic. And even if this, history lesson washed over you, you took some things, you left some things, allow something to settle in your heart. Allow a little seed to be planted so that you can revisit it anytime you want. And I think, if nothing else, the witch offers us a beautiful glimpse of hope. I love that word, of really knowing who you are and where you stand in the world. So thank you guys so much for joining me. It was such a pleasure to share about the witch with you. And I'll see you next time under the moon gate.